KwaZulu-Natal has experienced some unusual weather patterns, including the 2022 devastating floods that killed more than 400 people and it cost the province over 40 billion rand. And you'll also remember there was that tornado that dismantled communities in the uThongathi area. And of course, who can forget the recent heavy snowfall. Now, to mitigate and respond to these weather challenges, KwaZulu-Natal's Premier Thami Ntuli yesterday announced a multi-sectoral approach, including the establishment of the KwaZulu-Natal Climate Change and Sustainability Council, and also acquiring weather predictive technology to assist in this regard. So to talk to us more about the significance of this announcement, we're joined here in studio by Dr Nomhle Ngwenya, who's an independent climate change researcher and a member of the National Advisory Council on Innovation in South Africa. Dr. Ngwenya, always a pleasure speaking to you. Welcome to Morning Live once more.
Thank you very much for having me.
So let's talk about the significance of yesterday's announcement, because, you know, when one thinks of KwaZulu-Natal, when one thinks of the eThekwini area, for example, that has for so many years been seen as the playground for many South Africans because, among other things, the weather has always been so fantastic. At least when we were growing up, you knew you could go to Durban, the weather would be good, even in the heart of winter. Those days are gone. They're far from, you know, what we see right now. So how significant was yesterday's announcement in the broader scheme of things?
So I think it's very important to just highlight how it's becoming, very important for us to understand how climate change is very real and the impacts are very real of it. We've seen, as you said earlier on, the 2022 floods. We've also seen extreme weather events across 2023, but also looking at the past 2 weekends, we're seeing how, KZN is actually a very vulnerable province to the impacts of extreme weather events and climate change. So yesterday was quite groundbreaking in the sense that there's been a lot of criticism, from the public. The government is very much reactive and not proactive. So the KZN Premier Ntuli, in terms of establishing a climate change and sustainability council, that actually is a very proactive approach because KZN is finally realizing that these impacts are very real and they're not going anywhere. So we need to develop long-term mitigation strategies where the community and business community as well is also able to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So yesterday was quite a groundbreaking, announcement that was made. And also this council is the first of its kind in the country, but also on the continent as well.
So you talk about KwaZulu-Natal in particular being susceptible to some of these climate change impacts. Why is that?
So KwaZulu-Natal is located, it's located in the coastal area and specifically by the Indian Ocean. So the Indian Ocean is very vulnerable because when we look at climate change, we're seeing increasing temperatures in the ocean. And already Indian Ocean is already warm. So when we have increasing temperatures, that becomes very vulnerable for things like floods to come through. The past 2 weekends, we saw things like low pressure systems moving across, but this was even more impactful because of these increasing temperature conditions. So KZN is a very, very vulnerable province because it is located by the Indian Ocean.
So, you also, and I mentioned it in the introduction as well, just last week, the snow and people getting trapped in their cars. We spoke about the 2022 floods that were hugely catastrophic for KZN. But looking at that, and you and I had a quick chat about, some of the indicators and how we respond as human beings, because you would have the weather forecasters giving us these warnings, telling us about possible inclement weather, but we don't necessarily, I suppose, understand quite what the impact of those warnings are or respond to them or would even know how to respond even if they were issued. So how do we make ourselves, at least more knowledgeable about listening to the weather forecast and what actually those warnings are about?
So in the past 2 weekends, I think what we saw take place is two parts. There was a part of just ignoring the weather warnings, where people have weather apps but do not really take heed to the weather warnings that were present. So there's an issue also around accountability as the public. But the second aspect speaks to around, the level of awareness in education as to do people really understand what a level 6, 7, 8 warning means, right? Yesterday, Premier Ntuli spoke around the importance of ensuring that as much as we invest in early warning monitoring systems, we need to ensure that the information is disseminated in a manner in which, for example, farmers in rural communities in KZN are able to understand the information. So it's very important that the research and development, that's factored in, but also ensuring that, climate change, extreme weather events are also incorporated into, school curriculum, So that's where Department of Basic Education, higher education become very important. And I think what we're seeing here is that, with just addressing the impacts of climate change, of extreme weather events, is not just only a COCTA issue. It's a really multi-sectoral, collaboration that needs to happen within different departments. We saw how, during the long weekend in September, it was not just COCTA that was responsive. We saw how, defense was involved, social development, etc. So we really need different departments to also, collaborate and come into play to ensure that there also is law enforcement in terms of when there are weather warnings, people heed to that and do not travel long distances and are in safe areas during that time.
And when we talk about, the science behind it, the innovation, the technology for these early warning systems, for example, what exactly are we looking at that the province could incorporate?
So definitely, I think one of the things that I must highlight is that South Africa has skilled forecasters. So in terms of the science, weather science, we look at the South African Weather Services. We already have the brilliant research and infrastructure that's available. What tools, for example, artificial intelligence can enhance is basically just also trying to predict in the short, medium and long term what would be the potential impacts of an event, and how do we then also monitor it so that we are able to develop strategies in place to ensure that the impact is reduced. If we look at countries, for example, like Netherlands, they have disaster risk modeling. So the disaster risk modeling takes into account, months, days, weeks and months in order to forecast what are the potential impacts of a disaster and how does the government and communities adapt to that. So it's very important that, the information and, the R&D is already there. We are just enhancing what we already have to ensure that the impacts are not as disastrous and devastating as we've seen in the past 2 years.
So KZN, of course, they are now responding to what has already happened. Hopefully these early warning systems will be introduced, but what does this mean for the rest of the country? Because surely the rest of the country will not be spared. The impact may be different from province to province, but what can be learned from this, and what should the rest of the provinces be doing in line with what KZN is trying to do?
So I think with yesterday, just, the groundbreaking establishment of that council is definitely something that, all the other remaining provinces can definitely implement and incorporate. I think there's going to be a lot of focus on KZN, because this is a new council that's being established, and I think there are going to be lessons learned that other provinces, can definitely incorporate. But I think another important point that other provinces and KZN should also, factor in is the issue around budget. It's all good and all to have, councils that are established, but where is the private sector capital or, budget money going to be mobilized in order to ensure that there are, investments in adaptation and mitigation strategies? If we just take a look at COCTA, in the 2024-2025 budget, about 85% of that is being, budgeted for disaster relief grants. But is it possible that, we can maybe look at, maybe disaster relief grants is not the only main component. We need to invest in things like spatial planning, right? When a disaster strikes, we have stormwater drainage systems that are impacted that could potentially be health hazards. We also need to invest in how do we allocate land to ensure that, communities that are by low-lying areas by rivers are not going to be impacted. And again, also investing in enhanced R&D for us to continuously be aware, and track, the impacts of climate change from the present into the future as well.
Dr. Ngwenya, could speak to you for a long, long time, but we have to leave it there, unfortunately, for now. Dr. Nomhle Ngwenya, independent climate change researcher and also a member of the National Advisory Council on Innovation South Africa, giving us her analysis on KwaZulu-Natal's climate change weather response as announced yesterday by the KZN Premier Thami Ntuli.